now adjourn?
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Mr. Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I just say on a personal note, as you leave the chair, it has been a pleasure to serve briefly under you in this debate, but I welcome the Deputy Speaker to his place. The issue I want to raise this evening is, and I should perhaps just clarify, because the enunciators earlier today had the topic wrong. They were actually describing it or listing it as mineral mining in Bradford. So I hope that the Minister has been duly informed that it's actually mining in Barford in my constituency. So I don't want to disappoint anyone, but that's exactly what I'll be speaking on. This is not a parochial issue. It is an issue of principle. And it relates to a village, Barford, 1,500 people, in the constituency of Warwick and Leamington, my constituency. And of course, it'd be very easy to just consider that this is a one-off debate, a one-off issue, that it may be parochial to that particular village. But as I said, it is about principle. With Brexit, and of course much of today, as yesterday and last week and the months before, has been discussed. And I'm sure many people would like a break from that. But, you know, this issue that I'm about to elaborate on relates to environmental standards as much as it does anything else. And this is where many of us on these benches have been speaking out about how we wish to defend how important it is to us to ensure that environmental protections are maintained at the highest level, that we have dynamic alignment with European regulations. So the proposals for this quarry site are in a little village or little hamlet called Wasperton, just adjacent to the village of Barford. And it's been identified by Warwickshire County Council as part of its minerals plan. And the purpose of the site is for the mining, the excavation of sand and gravel. And for over a year, I've been supporting the community in their campaign, because the site is huge. It almost dwarfs the village. The area is an approximately level area of 85 hectares of arable farmland, part of which, approximately 50% of which, is high-grade agricultural land, what is termed BMV, i.e. best and most versatile. Now, the land is currently owned by St John's College, and the proposed quarry site would lie just 350 metres from the edge of the village of Barford. And the location is important here, because in identifying sites across the county of Warwickshire, Site 4, as it's known, near Barford, is the only one with a large village and a school nearby. And under the current plan, work at the quarry, as I say, would take place just 350 metres from the southern edge of the village. Now, the proposals are due to be submitted for consideration to the Planning Inspectorate in a few weeks' time. And we'll expect to report an outcome of deliberations in the spring of 2020, and possibly for the plan to be scheduled for adoption in December 2020. Now, I do recognise there is a need for such minerals. For all authorities up and down the land, there is this challenge of where do we find sand and gravels that we need for our construction industry. And in its plan, Warwickshire County Council states the following: the main issue for this plan is to address the shortfall in sand and gravel. Without adequate sand and gravel, there will not be enough aggregate to serve the construction industry in the county and the sub-region. Now, the premise for this is, of course, a calculation based on need, and those assumptions that are the basis of that calculation And I would suggest that fundamental to this is how it has been arrived at. And indeed, the construction industry, the construction of housing, has already been identified to be overstated. The local 5-year housing supply identified 17,000 homes for construction in Warwick District. Yet the revised Office of National Statistics forecasts a need for half that figure. And I think there are other parts of the country where this overstatement is reflected, perhaps elsewhere, but maybe not to the same scale. Now, this is a critical part of the point I want to make, the argument. But there are other issues that I want to address as well. There is the matter of access to the site. As the Council's plan states, generally mineral extraction sites are not approved if they require lorries to travel through minor roads and centres of population, including both towns and villages. Any site submissions with predicted transport or highway problems will be rejected unless it can be demonstrated that the issues can be satisfactorily mitigated. Now, interestingly, at the first public consultation stage of the plan, there were 8 allocations that were required to deliver 8 million tonnes. But following a further decline in sales, this plan required only 6.5 million tonnes, which could be delivered through 6 allocations. Now, the sites are spread geographically across Warwickshire, but 2 sites had been withdrawn, one much further to the south, nearer Stratford upon Avon, and another more immediately south of this proposed site. Now, it's claimed by the Council that this site, Wasperton, should serve Stratford upon Avon, Warwick and Leamington in terms of its development needs. But I am not convinced, and nor is the public. The issues are best summarised by the following points. Firstly, an excess to the actual need, as I've already identified, the oversupply of houses, according to the Office for National Statistics. Secondly, the site's proximity to the village, the 350 metres that I've already alluded to. And thirdly, the site's proximity to the village school. And it should be noted that the site is to the south of the village, directly south, so threatened by dust and silicates from this sand that would be excavated, those silicates blown over by prevailing winds. But let me start with the fundamental question of whether it is actually needed. Perhaps most concerning, based on those calculations that I just described, but also is the role really of the landowner, St John's College, Oxford. And I wrote to the president myself in the late spring. I have to say I was not particularly pleased by the response I got from the president of the college, because, you know, this college is the wealthiest college in Oxford. It does not need the money. So why has it put forward this site when it is going to be so harmful to the lives of all the residents and the children of Barford and Wasperton? And you know, the claim, and a disingenuous claim, I believe, that it was making the land available for housing development. Well, it was not. This land will be opened up, it will be dug up, and despite being high-grade agricultural land, it will become an eyesore, open to the extraction of sand and gravel. And you know, Mr. Deputy Speaker, even the student body of St John's College passed a motion to stand against the project. There is widespread concern and dismay that a college with the wealth of St John's should be allowing this to happen. They do not need to be conceding to sell this land to allow this excavation, this mining. And you know, the National Planning Policy Framework, Mr. Deputy Speaker, states that MPAs should make provision for a sand and gravel land bank for at least 7 years of permitted reserves. But as I've already said, there is sufficient land bank. It currently stands at 8 years, but the numbers in the calculation of how many houses are required does not suggest it is needed at all. So why do we need this material? Not just the quantity of housing, as I've said, but the materials that are used themselves. The assumption is that we will continue to use sand and gravel in the same quantities as in the past. But this is not sustainable development. It's not sustainable on our environment, because sand and gravel in construction use so much energy, whether it be in the forging of bricks or other materials such as concretes and so on. And I stated there are other concerns about the proximity, the concerns that the villagers, the community have themselves. And this is essentially about the dust emissions and the impact on residents' own health and their children's health. Whilst the County Council have proposed measures to reduce dust, these will not prevent the prevailing winds carrying dust over the village, and the proposals do not offer any guarantee that the quarry will not have negative health impacts. The dust from the quarry will contain silica, which can be extremely harmful to the elderly and young children. As I said, with the primary school of St. Peter's so close by, the 170 students there will be put at particular risk. And at this point, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like to just remark on the fantastic campaigning work being done by the school. They see the risks, they recognise the threats, and they are determined to ensure this quarry is never realised. But just related to the point about the toxicity of the air, there's an organisation called the Environmental Working Group. It's a US-based body specialising in research and advocacy, who quote, "None of the air quality standards for silica are adequate to protect people living or working near sand mining sites. The danger of airborne silica is especially acute for children. Silica air pollution has become a danger for residents near open sand mining and processing. Children, older adults and others with existing disease are especially at risk." We think when we talk about silicates and these very fine materials, we often think about PM10s, PM2.5s, and the Minister and I have exchanged in other debates just about the threats of these particles to human health. And I believe the Minister shares with me a real concern about the sort of environment, the air quality that we should have, and particularly for young people. But that point about these particulates, we're reminded of with, say, asbestos, about those microfibers and how damaging they are to our lungs, and particularly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to developing young lungs and other organs. And these should not be allowed to enter into the atmosphere, certainly within a couple of 100 metres of a primary school. Now, the organisation, the Environmental Working Group, have concerns for residents living within 1,500 metres of any excavation site because of this dissipation of dust particles. And the evidence that they have produced shows that silica levels measured near open sand mining in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and there's no difference between those sites in that part of the world to here in the UK. But they identified that those silica levels were at least 10 times higher than the 3 micrograms per cubic metre, which is the recommended limit. Let me just turn now to the infrastructure and its unsuitability. The inadequacy of local highways, which cannot accommodate the development and the resulting air pollution caused by 60 heavy goods vehicles accessing the site each day. There are also the wider environmental issues, the irreparable damage to the high-grade farmland, including versatile land, the 400-year-old hedgerows and trees, and the 3 Grade 2 listed properties that will be impacted by it. The closest of those is just 100 metres from the quarry itself. And maybe I could just identify one of the agribusinesses, one of the fine farms on this super high-grade farmland that produces top-quality salad ingredients. They have 2 crops a year, and these we have to protect these sorts of farm producers, because we think that the alternative is often the case to have them air freighted in from other countries. But here we can produce them locally, and this should be encouraged and protected. And if I may just add one other point, and that's the social issue, where we have long-term farming tenants who will also be displaced as a result of any quarry. Now, the government and this minister should be aware that there have been over 750 written letters of objection and a further 300 objections registered online, all opposing Warwickshire County Council's plans. And let me just put that in perspective. There are only 1,500 villages. Their campaign, Mr. Deputy Speaker, has been relentless. And as I say, I commend them for the work that they've been doing. And I have tried and been determined myself to support and stand by them throughout. I've written to DEFRA, to the Secretary of State. I wrote to the Secretary of State, the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government, to raise planning concerns about this. And I've also met with the County Council and with many residents in the village of Barford itself. And as I mentioned earlier, I wrote to St John's College itself. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if I may, in summary, just restate that the housing numbers on which this plan is predicated are wrong. They have been overstated. The Office for National Statistics has said that they are significantly higher than what is actually required. And as I said just a moment ago, we are assuming that we're going to be using sands and gravels in the same quantities as we ever did to construct housing and buildings in the same way that we have always done. But there is a revolution in the way housing is being made and being built. So it is wrong to make that assumption. I then mentioned about the proximity of the site to the village. The fact that the site, the quarry site proposed, is just 350 metres from the village and a little bit further from the school. And this issue, this huge issue of air toxicity needs to be addressed. You know, in other countries, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is a minimum exclusion zone. And this is legally established. For example, in Canada, their regulations, I think, state a minimum of 600 metres. And why are we not adopting this? These are the sorts of standards we should be including in the Environment Bill, but also in how we consider in our environmental practices should we be leaving the EU. But the community is clear in its demands. They want to see the government to legislate to restrict the mining of mineral materials that release silica dust to sites that are a safe distance from residential areas, and they would like to see a minimum of 1,000 metres. This is not difficult. This should be the sort of legislation that the government is capable of introducing. As I said, this is the only site in the Warwickshire plan that actually is near a large village and near a school, and that is why it should be excluded from the Warwickshire County Council Minerals Plan. And as I said, this land is high-grade farmland. We need high-grade farmland to produce the foods that we depend on. We need food resilience in this country. And finally, may I just quote, and I'm sure the Minister won't mind, from the government's own national planning policy, reminding that DEFRA have said that the National Planning Policy Framework seeks to protect the best and most versatile farmland. This is such a case, and I would ask the Minister to intervene and ensure this quarry is not allowed. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Minister Rebecca Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for bringing this debate, and I know he does care about the environment. He actually took over from me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on the all-party electric vehicle group, so we have a connection about caring for the environment and emissions and such like, and he's right to raise issues that relate to his constituency of Warwick and Leamington. And I do, however, hope that he appreciates that there is a due and proper process to be followed with the consideration of local planning, and that given the Secretary of State's quasi-judicial role in the planning system, I'm unable to comment on the detail of individual mineral local plans. I'm sure the Honourable Member knew that I would say that. The Government is committed to ensuring the independence of the examination process for local plans, and local people must have confidence that the examination of local plans for their communities is fair and open, and that decisions are made impartially. And I do understand that Warwickshire County Council are proposing to submit the Warwickshire Minerals Plan to the Planning Inspectorate in the coming weeks, and therefore neither myself nor my right honourable and honourable friends at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, with whom I know that the Honourable Member has had many exchanges over this issue, are in a position to directly address the specific concerns raised by the Honourable Gentleman's constituents, and consideration of the Warwickshire Minerals Plan will be done in accordance with the planning system. I am, however, happy to discuss the crucially important topic of protecting our constituents, local communities and the environment from any impacts from development. National planning policy and guidance requires mineral planning authorities to plan for a steady and adequate supply of aggregates, including crushed rock, sand and gravel, by designating specific sites, designating preferred areas or designating areas of search. And designating specific sites provides more certainty about when and where development will take place. However, I do fully understand the concerns that people such as the residents of Barford have when development is proposed in their local area, particularly where those concerns include the potential development that may result in environmental impacts in their community, homes and businesses. We therefore need to be sure that we have clear and strong environmental regulation and planning controls that work for the environment, for people, for business. And the Environment Agency and local planning authorities therefore each have distinct roles with regard to pollution and planning controls to enable this to happen, as I'm sure the Honourable Member is well aware. And anyone with concerns, they must be confident that the system is designed to listen to their concerns. And that's why all the steps of our planning system are supported by a public consultation process through which stakeholders may consider the proposals and voice any concerns they may have to the local planning authority. And I do understand that over 1,000 people responded to that to the Warwickshire Minerals Local Plan consultation in 2030, as we've heard, and clearly that is a large number of people for the small area of the village. But once the local planning authority has prepared and consulted on a local plan, as Warwickshire have done, it's submitted to the Secretary of State, who will appoint an inspector to carry out an independent examination, and this process is dealt with by the Planning Inspectorate. The examination will assess whether the plan has been prepared in accordance with the legal and procedural requirements and if it is sound. And the 4 tests of soundness are set out in the National Planning Policy Framework. And I will of course, give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. And I totally accept that process and how that normally, the kind of cogs of local government and so on, turn. But my question, I guess, is actually around the assumptions. And those of us who are quite close to the changes in the whole construction industry and the sorts of housing that we'll have in the future would be saying, will we be requiring these materials in the same quantity as we've done in the past, when modular housing and other forms of construction are coming through, and therefore the dependence and need for sand and gravels will be greatly reduced?
Thank you, and of course the member makes a really sound point, but that is all assumption and we have no data. One has to work on data, as the councils have to. They have to prepare their 5-year plan for housing allocation, as they also have to do with minerals and all of the other things. So that's why we have a system for how these things will work. Clearly they might change in the future, but that's all just supposition, if I might be so bold as to say that right now. And so that's why we have a process. And the inspector, the planning inspector, will consider the evidence provided by the local planning authority to support the plan and any representations which have been put forward by local people and other interested parties. And the proposed allocation at Barford will be considered as part of that examination, and the inspector will take into account the issues and viewpoints raised by the representations made, including those from residents in Barford regarding the allocation at Wasperton Farm. And clearly they can make all those cases about whether or not they think one needs this amount of crushed gravel right now at this specific time. But we have a process for the council deciding whether they think that is the guidance they want to abide by. And unfortunately, by its very nature, new developments, whether they be housing or whether they be mineral extraction, will have some impact on the local environment. And it's for this reason that we have clear and defined measures by which development proposals and their potential impact on residents, local communities and the environment are assessed. And the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, includes a requirement for local plans to be accompanied by a sustainability appraisal, Mr Deputy Speaker. And the sustainability appraisal plays an important part in demonstrating that the local plan actually respects the sustainability of those objectives, which is actually something I think the Honourable Member is referring to. And that all has to be taken into account. And the sustainability appraisal of the Warwickshire Minerals Plan incorporated a strategic environmental assessment, which actually included an assessment of the site at Wasperton Farm, and a habitats regulation assessment was also undertaken, which considered the potential of significant effects on habitat sites and species located within Warwickshire and the vicinity. And the proposed mineral local plan policy for the allocation at Wasperton Farm includes a number of requirements in relation to access, environmental matters and phased restoration of the site. And these considerations will all need to be taken into account if individual planning applications are made. And given that the proposed site at Wasperton Farm is actually pretty large, 85 hectares, any future planning application for quarry activities will need to be accompanied by an environmental impact assessment. And this process assesses the potential for environmental effects, including those to land, i.e. agricultural land, which was referred to, air quality, which has been referred to in particular, and this needs to be considered by the local authority against the local air quality plan and their plans for that. Dust has to be considered, which was also raised in particular, the health of local residents, noise levels, transport, the landscape, and local and long distance views, which I understand was something particularly raised by the residents of Barford. And it would be remiss of me, though, not to highlight that also the process gives consideration to the potential positive impacts of such a development on the economy and local employment and such like. So, similarly to the local plan-making process, the environmental impact assessment process requires consultation with stakeholders, and this process will allow Warwickshire County Council to determine any planning application should one be submitted. The local planning authority will also have the power to set conditions which any approved application must adhere to, and the local planning authority can actually take action if it's deemed that any condition is being breached, Mr Chairman. I fully appreciate that I have been unable to address the specific concerns raised by the Honourable Gentleman or the concerns raised by the residents of Barford, but it's absolutely right, but as their Member of Parliament, that they are being raised on their behalf. That is the right thing to do, and I would probably do the same for the residents of Taunton Deane. However, I do hope that my explanation of the planning and permitting system and the measures by which we seek to manage any potential environmental impacts have provided some reassurance.